The House of Whispering Shadows. It was a night like no other when Margaret Waverley first laid eyes on the mansion. The wind howled through the trees, whipping around the jagged silhouette of the house that loomed like a ghost in the distance. Standing at the wrought iron gates, her breath caught in her chest, and the faint scent of decay hung in the air. The house was old, too old. Its once grand windows were dark, like the empty eyes of some forgotten beast, watching from the shadows. Margaret had inherited the house from a distant relative she barely knew, an aunt whose name was whispered among the townspeople in fearful tones. The Waverley estate, as it was called, had been abandoned for decades, left to rot in the countryside. The townsfolk warned her not to go, speaking in hushed voices about the strange happenings that plagued the land, the unnatural chill that surrounded the mansion, and the whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls. But Margaret, determined to uncover her family's secrets, ignored their warnings. She was a scholar of history, and the mansion's mysteries intrigued her. As she stepped inside, the door creaked loudly, a mournful sound that echoed through the empty halls. The air was thick with dust, and the grand staircase that rose before her was choked with cobwebs. Every step she took seemed to disturb the silence, the house groaning as if it were waking from a long slumber. Margaret shivered, not just from the cold, but from something else, something unseen, pressing against her very soul. She could feel the house watching her, its presence heavy and oppressive. But she dismissed the feeling, chalking it up to the isolation of the place and her own nerves. She made her way deeper into the mansion, her footsteps soft on the faded carpet. A sudden flicker of movement in the corner of her eye made her stop. She turned, but the hallway was empty. She frowned. Perhaps it was the wind. She reached a door at the end of the hall, its wood darkened with age and something else, something darker. With a deep breath, she pushed it open, and as she did, a chill ran down her spine. The room was vast, and the air was thick with the scent of old wood and something wrong. There, in the center of the room, stood an ancient mirror. The frame was intricately carved, its surface marred by years of neglect. Yet, as Margaret stepped closer, she felt an odd pull, a compulsion to look deeper, as though the mirror were calling to her. She gazed into its reflective surface, expecting to see only her own face staring back. But what she saw instead froze her blood. A shadow, dark and shifting, moved behind her, its form barely visible in the reflection. She spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The shadow was gone. Or so she thought. Margaret's pulse raced, her eyes scanning the room, but there was no sign of the shadow. She forced herself to breathe deeply, trying to quell the rising tide of unease that gripped her chest. It was just the house, she thought. Old buildings had a way of playing tricks on the mind, creaking floors, strange drafts, and shadows that seemed to move in the corners of one's vision. But deep down, she knew something was different here. This house was not like any other. With a hesitant hand, she reached for the mirror again. Her fingers brushed against the cold glass, and the surface rippled ever so slightly, as if it were alive. She recoiled, her heart skipping a beat, but curiosity got the better of her. She leaned closer, staring at the reflection. And this time, the shadow was not in the background. It was there, in the mirror, standing right beside her. It was a figure, a tall, slender shape, draped in dark robes that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light. Its face was obscured by the hood, but Margaret could feel its eyes on her, staring into her very soul. She stumbled back, horrified, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move, but the air around her grew colder, and the whispers began, low at first, like the murmur of distant voices. Margaret. The voice came from the mirror. Or was it in her mind? She backed away, her legs trembling, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. The whispers continued, growing louder now, more insistent. Margaret. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the room, as if something had broken. Margaret whirled around, her eyes darting to the source of the sound. There, on the far wall, a painting hung crookedly, its once detailed image now distorted and torn. The canvas seemed to pulse, as though something beneath it were alive, pressing against the fabric. Before she could react, the mirror's surface rippled again, this time with a violent force. The shadows within the glass began to swirl, twisting and contorting into shapes that were impossible to comprehend. Margaret's breath quickened, and her heart thudded painfully in her chest. The air grew thick with a dark presence, suffocating her. She could feel the weight of something ancient, something evil, pressing in from all sides. The whispers became clearer, louder, more maddening. "Come to us." Without thinking, Margaret turned and fled, her legs barely carrying her as she ran down the hall. The house seemed to warp around her, the walls stretching and shifting, as though the very structure of the mansion was alive. She reached the stairs and scrambled down them, her mind spinning. She had to leave. She had to get out of this place before it swallowed her whole. But as she reached the front door, she found it shut tight. She pulled on the handle with all her strength, but it didn't budge. Panic surged within her, and she spun around, searching for another way out. The mansion was alive, she realized. It wasn't just an old house. It was something more. Something ancient and cursed. A figure stepped into the doorway, blocking her path. Margaret froze. It was the same shadow from the mirror, but now it stood before her, its form materializing into something both terrifying and mesmerizing. Its dark robes billowed like smoke, and its face, hidden beneath the hood, remained a shadow. But from beneath the cloak, two glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, their gaze cold and empty. "Why do you resist?" the figure whispered, its voice low and guttural. "You are part of us now." Margaret's breath caught in her throat as the figure took a step forward, its presence overwhelming. She felt the weight of its gaze press against her chest, crushing her. The whispers rose to a crescendo, echoing in her ears. The door behind her rattled, as though something were trying to force its way in from the outside. Margaret's mind raced. She had to escape. But where could she go? The house had already claimed her, its grip tightening around her like a vice. She turned to face the figure, her body trembling, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head, as if considering her question. Then it stepped closer, its cloak rustling like the wind. "You are not the first to enter this house," it said, its voice now echoing through the halls. "Many have come before you. But none have left." Margaret's eyes widened in horror as the walls of the house seemed to close in around her. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, and the floor beneath her feet began to shift, as if the house itself were breathing. The figure reached out, its cold hand brushing against her arm, sending a jolt of ice through her body. "You belong to us now," it whispered. "And we will never let you go." With that, the figure disappeared, leaving Margaret alone in the dark, her heart racing as the house's whispers filled her ears. Margaret stood frozen, her entire body trembling with fear. The oppressive silence of the house weighed heavily on her, and she could hear the faint, ghostly whispers echoing in the darkness around her. The coldness of the figure's touch still lingered on her arm, a chilling reminder that whatever this place was, it was far from ordinary. She glanced around, desperate for an escape. The grand staircase loomed before her, its steps cracked and uneven, but it seemed like the only way to get away from the creeping sense of doom that hung in the air. She turned and bolted toward the stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but as she reached the first step, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift again. The mansion groaned, as if it were alive, its very foundations quaking with some unfathomable force. Margaret staggered back, clutching the railing to steady herself. Something was wrong. The house was changing, warping before her eyes. The walls seemed to stretch and sway, their angles twisting and distorting, creating impossible geometries that didn't belong in the real world. The hallway behind her had vanished, replaced by a dark, empty void, as though the mansion was folding in on itself. Her heart raced as the whispers returned, louder now, more frantic. "Leave." The voice was clearer, more insistent. It was no longer the shadowed figure, but something else, something darker, more sinister. Margaret spun around, her mind screaming for her to run, but there was no way forward. The path to the front door was blocked by an impenetrable wall of shadows. She couldn't even see the outline of the door anymore. It was as though the house itself was closing in on her, trapping her in this nightmare. Her chest tightened as the air around her grew colder, and the shadows shifted once more, revealing twisted shapes that seemed to emerge from the very walls. Figures, dark and monstrous, lurched from the corners of the room, their forms writhing and undulating like something out of a nightmare. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, fixed on her with an insidious hunger. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to be coming from every direction at once. They spoke of things that made no sense, names, places, promises of endless torment. Margaret. The name came again, more insistent, like a warning. But this time, it was not the shadowed figure speaking. The voice was different. It was deeper, more ancient. Margaret clutched her head, the pressure in her skull intensifying as the voices pressed against her mind, threatening to break her sanity. She sank to her knees, her vision blurring, the walls of the house spinning around her. Then, through the madness, one word broke through the din of whispers. A name. Abigail. Her heart skipped a beat. It was her aunt's name. The very aunt who had left her this cursed house. The same aunt who had disappeared years ago, without a trace. The house trembled as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. The shadows closed in around Margaret, and for a moment, she thought she saw the figure from the mirror, its glowing eyes staring at her with malevolent intent. But then something else emerged from the darkness. A shape, familiar yet not, appeared before her. It was the figure of a woman, but her features were obscured by the shadows. Her face was hidden, but Margaret could feel the cold, suffocating presence of this new figure. She felt its gaze pierce through her, as if it could see everything, every fear, every secret she had ever kept. The woman spoke, her voice a low, rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You should not have come here, Margaret," the voice said. "This house, this place, it does not welcome the living." The ground beneath Margaret's feet cracked, and the house seemed to shudder in response. The figure took a step closer, its presence overwhelming, its aura one of death and decay. "What do you want from me?" Margaret managed to gasp, her voice hoarse. The figure's form shifted, its body dissolving into shadows, but its voice remained. "I want nothing," it whispered. "It is the house that desires you. It has been waiting for you." Margaret's mind raced. She could feel her grip on reality slipping as the darkness threatened to engulf her. She had to get out, she had to escape before it was too late. But then, the mirror, the cursed mirror, flashed in her mind. She remembered the pull she had felt earlier, the way it had drawn her in, as if it were a gateway to something far beyond this world. Without thinking, she scrambled toward the nearest wall, her hands searching for anything that could help her. Her fingers brushed against something cold and smooth, the surface of the mirror. She didn't hesitate. She reached out and grabbed it, her fingers digging into the frame, as if holding on to the last thread of reality. The whispers reached a deafening pitch, and the shadows swirled violently around her, pulling at her body, dragging her closer to the mirror. The figure's form reappeared before her, its glowing eyes burning with rage. "No!" Margaret screamed. "I won't stay here." With a force she didn't know she had, she hurled herself toward the mirror, plunging her hands into the glass. And in that moment, everything went silent. The house vanished. The shadows dissolved. The oppressive air lifted. Margaret was no longer in the mansion. She stood in an empty room, surrounded by nothing but darkness. There were no walls, no ceilings, just an endless void stretching out before her. But then, she heard a sound. A faint whisper. Her name. Margaret. She turned, but saw nothing. And then, from the depths of the darkness, something began to stir.